Fantasy isn't about realism, you might say. You're not wrong, however, it does have a place, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Realism in fantasy is a concept I've been tossing around in my mind ever since some of Skolagrim's oldest videos I watched around a decade ago. Which fantasy swords are over-designed? Should dwarves really use one-handed axes and shields? That sort of thing. Realism and fantasy aren't terms that we tend to put side by side as standalone concepts, though realistic fantasy is certainly a pretty prevalent genre. It also isn't always super clear what realism even means relative to fantasy settings, given that by definition the point is to include unrealistic concepts in various ways. So in this context, though it'll change a little depending on what exactly we're talking about, realism is the ability to maintain believability, immersion, and at least enough of a connection to conventional reality that the audience doesn't feel lost or detached from the story. But given that depending on who you ask, realism can mean making exact depictions of medieval society, or it can mean something as far down as just making sure that your internal logic is consistent as realism. So neither of those assumptions are correct per se, so just bear in mind that we may all see this concept slightly differently. Realism tends to be best described as being on a scale. On one end you have your Game of Thrones, and on the other you have your classic pulpy sword and sorcery types, older editions of D&D being a particular example. Neither of these is better than the other, and that's why I'm going to talk some about the draws, the balance, and some of the downsides of various levels of realism in my personal experience, as it relates to different aspects of fantasy storytelling. And rather than dividing the video into sections based on the levels of realism, we're going to go by the things your level of realism might affect, with the first of them being Part 1, Tone. Tone is everything in storytelling. It is the feeling, the expectations, the vibe, for lack of a better word. And the first thing I have to say about it in relation to realism is that tone is not deterministic towards your level of realism, nor vice versa, but there are some trends and ways to subvert those trends. The archetypal way of conceiving tone as it pertains to realism is basically that the more realistic something is, the more serious, dark, or grim it may be, and the less realistic something is, the more pleasant, uplifting, and whimsical it might be. For these purposes, I'm actually going to use 3 different tabletop RPG systems that fall on different parts of our little realism scale. The first of these is D&D, 5e in particular, which I think we can all safely agree falls on the unrealistic side of the scale. The second is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, which falls roughly in the middle, though it definitely skews a little more realistic than unrealistic. And then the third is Gold Rush Games' Sengoku, which you almost certainly haven't heard of, but it's so realistic that you could probably use it to write several different academic papers on the Sengoku Jidai, which was the series of conflicts in Japan that led to the end of the Ashikaga shogunate and the rise of the Tokugawa. In terms of tone with these systems, you'd think it's fairly linear. D&D 5e is generally, and I say that because it's so flexible that you can realistically just do whatever you want with it, but it's still generally going to be pretty positive in tone. You've got your heroes, you've got your baddies, and you've got the dungeons your heroes loot so that they can later beat the crap out of said baddies. Then, of course, Sengoku is much more reserved. It takes its subject matter very seriously, including authentic representations of the way 16th century Japan treated lower-class people, women, or just other disempowered groups. Seppuku is a mechanic in the game that characters are expected to participate in should the circumstances dictate such. Then, of course, in the middle, we have Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which is about, oh wait, it's a Warhammer setting. It's not pleasant or in the middle at all. In fact, in the creators of Warhammer Fantasy endeavoring to create such a historically inspired setting, then adding things like literal physical demons and eldritch gods, it turns out that setting is not at all in the middle when it comes to tone. And that's my point with this section. This part was a ruse. Don't let your level of realism dictate your tone, but make both consistent regardless. If you want another more extreme example, while I'd say 40k is generally more thought out than some people give it credit for, it is inarguably a very unrealistic universe. Space Marines anatomically probably could barely move at all, but nobody actually cares because that lack of realism is consistent with the tone, and that lack of realism is not the result of laziness. If there were really a trend, it might be that realistic settings will often be darker, but settings that are less realistic may just have more variation in this respect. But if you know any ultra-realistic yet very positive and uplifting settings, which I'm sure there are some that I'm forgetting about or don't know about, feel free to let me know. Anyway, I'll give you what you probably came here for now and talk about realism as it relates to Part 2, Warfare. I do not claim to be an expert, so let me just put that out there. Historians still argue to this day about the true level of effect the English longbowmen had on the Battle of Agincourt. And people have been arguing about it essentially since it happened centuries and centuries ago. So I'm not here to postulate about the exact killing capacity of a broadhead arrow fired at 160 feet per second that strikes an armored knight traveling 35 miles per hour on a horse at a 30-degree angle. I'm not that guy. What I'm here to discuss is when realism will and won't help you in regards to the description or the creation of combat mechanics, depending on if you're writing something or making a tabletop RPG. Realism in combat itself can be different from the overall realism of your story, and that's because especially in pre-modern gunpowder settings, combat is a very personal thing. Archers and mages have their place dealing with enemies at range, but two warriors duking it out with swords, first the stare down, then the clash of blades, and then the decisive strike is such an iconic trope that I doubt it'll ever die for good. Whether it's lightsabers, long swords, or if it is magical duels, the duel is the apex of the final battle between hero and villain, good and evil. And so here you are wondering how you might want to depict it. So in describing the effects of realism on warfare, we're going to work with scale, not the scale we were talking about earlier, but the scale of the fight. The area in which realism is the most skimped out on when it comes to warfare is, as you might expect, large-scale warfare. In the Hunger Games novels, for example, when Katniss is fighting a war against the government, we don't really focus on the battle tactics, the logistics through which her soldiers are supplied, or the battle over the hearts and minds of the populace, at least not in any great detail. That's not a problem. Large-scale warfare is basically infinitely complex. You have countless people who, from the dawn of time, have spent their entire lives studying war. As the infamous monologue from Blood Meridian goes, "Before man was, war waited for him, the ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be, that way and not some other way." Now, of course, if you've read the book, you'll know that this Judge Holden guy isn't really the type of person you want to be getting life advice from. But the point still stands that I cannot blame any type of writer for not wanting to get bogged down in the nigh infinite complexities of warfare. What you should keep in mind is that audiences will focus their attention on the places you point them to. Their eyes might tend to wander, so to speak, so if you will be brief in your large-scale warfare descriptions, make sure at least that they are consistent descriptions and that the results make sense. You don't have to describe the exact way in which the dwarfen army lures the elves into a trap, but the audience might notice if the dwarves seem to be caught off guard in one scene, the focus changes for a while, and suddenly the dwarves have handily won the fight. On the other hand, if you do want to get more specific with the details, the first thing I have to tell you is to learn. Hell, the first thing I tell anyone who wanted to write about any detailed topic would be just learn everything you can about it. But if you want to write warfare, learn yourself some warfare. Even just playing strategy games can get your foot in the door. But the big caveat is that you don't want to get lost in it. Some audiences will love authentic, realistic, and clever tactics. But if you spend 20 pages on describing the maneuvers of 60 cavalrymen that don't even impact the battle without dialogue or a break, you're going to find even the most dedicated of armchair generals are going to put the story down. When it comes to more personal fights, those 1v1 duels we all love, the story changes a bit. And that's because at the end of the day, no side should ever win a fight in a story just because they were better. If you have a scene of two knights dueling, you can have the most perfectly described choreography, the most nail-biting suspense. But if, in the end, it reads, "And so Sir John the Child Puncher was faster than Sir Mark the Drunkard, and struck him down," it'll be a little underwhelming. And this is because a duel in a story is not just a test of arms, it's a test of ideas. Once again, don't agree with this judge guy. I've seen too many literally me posts about him. But this one line does about sum up the idea I'm trying to get at. This is the nature of war, whose stake is at once the game and the authority and the justification. Seen so, war is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will and the will of another within that larger will which, because it binds them, is therefore forced to select. War is the ultimate game because war is at last a forcing of the unity of existence. War is divination is the point I'm getting at here, especially in stories. The winner of any given duel, especially when taken to have any symbolic meaning, is going to mean the triumph of all the things the winner represents. Sir John the Child Puncher should beat Sir Mark the Drunkard, not because he is faster or stronger, but because he is smarter and beats Sir Mark in tactics, because he is righteous, and him being called Child Puncher is only a slanderous nickname anyway, or because in general, he represents an idea that triumphs over the idea that Sir Mark the Drunkard represents. With all that in mind, in single combat, use realism to enhance the descriptive experience of your combat. Throw in that detail about half sorting to punch through armor. Add in the difficulty of approaching a spearman when only armed with an axe. But don't let it be your determining factor, unless that very thing is the larger point you are trying to make. And don't let it overpower the personalities and the emotions of the scene. But that brings us to a somewhat related fantasy topic, Part 3, magic. I've talked a little bit about realism and magic before in my world-building magic systems video, but the realism itself wasn't as much of a focus. You might also find it even more ironic to be talking about magic, quite literally the opposite of the concept of realism in this type of video. However, there is a very important set of points to be made here, and that is, with some tact and some thought, you can make your magic feel realistic. As enjoyers of fantasy, we all crave that immersion. We want to feel like we're there, fighting the dragons, standing tall against the forces of evil. And if you balance the feeling of your magic just right, you can maintain that immersion even while incredible feats of magic are performed. Did we ever lose immersion when Gandalf battled the Balrog? I didn't. There are two things I think can help make magic feel realistic, and neither of them are actually too much to do with what the magic is actually capable of at its peak. Of course, there are certainly things you can have your magic do that will break immersion, but those are the sorts of things that'd generally be obvious enough that I'm not going to waste your time describing them. But I will say this about powers themselves. Anytime you give your protagonists a magical ability to solve a particular situation, it's like putting a key on a ring. Every time your protagonist comes across that same lock again, so to speak, they should be able to use the same key, unless said key has been lost, broken, or the lock itself has changed. As you collect more keys, it'll become harder to remember the existence of each individual one. But when a lock finally comes around that your protagonist has the key for and they don't use it, you might not notice, but somebody will. So just bear in mind that every time you add a new power, you add a new key to the ring that you need to remember exists every time that character encounters a lock. And that brings us into the first of our points of immersion, limitations. Limitations are something that luckily are pretty well discussed in the fantasy zeitgeist as far as I can tell. I've even heard some variant of what I'm about to talk about be described as Sanderson's laws, and while I don't personally read much Sanderson, I can see what he was talking about. Limitations, for one, give you fewer skeleton keys to remember, to keep on with the analogy from earlier. Skeleton keys can be very dangerous as they multiply the amount of situations that your character should be able to solve by quite a margin. A way to describe this is as such. Our good old friend, protagonist Von Generic, has developed fire magic. He can create fire at will at any point he can see in any quality while being immune to it himself. That's cool and extremely useful. It might be too useful. If he can immolate anything he sees, the only limitation is that he could theoretically be subdued by a target he didn't see first, or a target that was just resistant to fire. But any other situation he could find that may require fire, he can solve it without even having to think about it. He'd be a WMD in warfare and have a higher capacity for arson than your average helldiver. He'd be essentially unstoppable and that would make him pretty uninteresting, especially if this level of power couldn't be found in his enemies. Tabletop RPGs often have pretty decent solutions built in just by necessity, as balanced magic is required for non-magic characters to be able to actually have fun playing the game alongside their wizardly companions. But the line can be a little harder to find in the written forms of storytelling. So let's modify protagonist's powers a little bit. First off, we're going to make it such that he can only conjure fire from his hands. He can throw it around, but that's where it has to originate. Even just with that, we've solved one of the main problems. Looking at someone and being able to just immediately set them on fire is not only too powerful, but it would lead to pretty boring fights. Then we'll take away the unlimited amounts and quantities of fire. We don't, and unless you're working with a very hard magic system, I wouldn't put exact numbers on everything, but we'll say he can conjure a roughly basketball-sized sphere of flame about a dozen times per day, and he can push it a little further if he needs. Though if he does this, he'll collapse from exhaustion as soon as the last one is thrown. He can go further without penalty if he can consume some Fanta beforehand. Now he has a limit, the capacity, albeit limited, to go beyond that limit, and the capacity to obtain a resource that can enhance his power and raise the limit. You can even use resources as limitations for powers in of themselves, with them being only usable at all if the character has access to their bespoke magical pick-me-up. While you could easily do more, that sort of sells the point of what I'm talking about. The second part of this is a little less concrete. This is the concept of earning one's magic. Really, any useful skill or capacity your characters have should feel earned, but given the otherworldly nature of magic, this need to feel earned is even more crucial to your success. Another way this can be interpreted is that where magic is not earned, it should feel deserved, or in yet other words, justified. While you could argue this isn't necessarily a topic of realism, I might say that, as stated at the beginning, in terms of fantasy, believability and realism kind of go hand in hand. There probably isn't a worse feeling for your audience to have upon seeing your character use magic in a new way than for them to think that they should not have that magic. It'll take them entirely out of the story and shatter the stakes. There are a few ways you can make gains in magic or any unique skill or ability feel earned, but before I even start with any of these, the one unifying factor is foreshadowing. Always foreshadow in some way. There needs to be build-up. Even if you do the things I'm about to tell you, foreshadowing can never do wrong. You can overdo it, but, foreshadowing is good. Anyway, the first is, for lack of a better word, out of suffering. But this only works once, as essentially an awakening event, which is why I'm getting it out of the way first. This is the Harry Potter example. Poor kid lives under the stairs with a family that detests him. Then he starts getting letters from the magical school, and we find out he can cast magic. We're generally, as an audience, okay with this, because alongside it being escapist and generally exciting, we feel bad for him, and so when those strange little abilities he had in his normal life turned out to be part of something bigger, we're more or less willing to buy it without putting up any fuss, especially because it is further justified later on. However, this explicitly does not work in a great deal of situations, particularly if your character has already begun their journey. Another way you can have a character gain powers in a darker situation is by doing so during the dark night of the soul, as it is often called in discussions on story structure. Only in the hero's darkest moment, and in particular their recovery from that darkest moment, does the gaining of new abilities start to feel natural. That's because in our own human experiences after leaving dark periods in our lives, we might find that we move forward with a new perspective. It's just that in fantasy stories, that perspective may also come with some magical boons. Aside from that, there is also the method of training. This one is on its own merit not the most interesting, as it's kind of linear, it's expected. Character trains, character learns, character is better at whatever they trained at, and that's it. However, the concept of the training arc wouldn't be a thing if that's all there was to it. So instead, if training is your solution, it should have a focus on character moments between them and those they may be training with, or if there's something interesting or unconventional about the training itself, focus on the process by which the training is done. Otherwise, this process is fairly straightforward. Make them train, make it difficult, and it'll start to feel right, as long as you also make it interesting. The last primary way to earn magic would be for the character to surmount a particularly notable challenge. Perhaps they gain a new magical item, or perhaps they're granted new knowledge. challenge. This is much like the Dark Night of the Soul method of magical growth, except with a more triumphant bent. Here, the point becomes that your protagonist has done something deserving of a reward, and so the reward becomes the earning of the magic. As long as the reward is proportional to the challenge, you can't go wrong. If, in Skyrim, all you got after climbing High Hrothgar was a souvenir t-shirt and a slap on the back, you'd probably uninstall the game. And if instead you got the ability to instant kill any enemy you saw just by looking their way, the rest of the game would just kind of be boring. Anyway, with that, I think I'm about done rambling about realism and fantasy. There is so much more that could be said, but these were the topics of realism and fantasy I had the strongest opinions and the most thought out points with. Tone doesn't dictate realism. Don't let it overpower the moments of emotion, and handle your magic in believable ways. If you have any thoughts of your own about realism and fantasy, let me know about them. I'd love to hear them. I hope you enjoyed, and since we're still small here at JBAT, every single like and subscription goes quite a long way. Anyway, if you want to hang out with my editor and I, we have a Discord, and if for some reason you're crazy enough to want it, we have a Patreon and channel memberships, all of this being in the description. I've also got to thank Shadowrunner, our $10 patron and a knight of the Inner Circle. Thank you for watching, and remember, when in doubt, the most historically authentic and realistic way to defeat an enemy is to end them rightly.